I go to the gym. 1, 2, check. 1, 2, 3, check. 1, 2.
This on? There we go. We ready to go, Brooks? Okay. Good evening, everybody. Okay, that was bad. We need to try that again. That was really pathetic. So, good evening, everybody. Yay, there you go. Welcome to our next installment of Sotterley Presents People and Perspectives. We have people joining us online tonight as well. We're so glad that you're here with us. Please do sign into the chat. Let us know where you're joining from tonight. And do know at the end of the evening, we'll have questions and answers. So you can go ahead and put that into the chat anytime that you would like. Catherine will be fielding them in the back. Catherine, our interpretive programs manager. So for those of you who I had not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Nancy Easterling. It's my honor to serve as the executive director here at Historic Sotterley. And this has been such an amazing season. We have loved all of the presenters so far. But we're really excited about tonight because this is somebody who I adore listening to. Every time I've heard him, he is amazing. And when he gets his next book out, you're coming back, and you got to promise me you're coming back, right? Of course he will. It's going to be fabulous. So let me introduce you to our dear friend, Mr. Ralph Eshelman. So Dr. Eshelman is a specialist in maritime history, history of the Chesapeake Bay, War of 1812 in the Chesapeake, geology, and vertebrate paleontology. He's just a slacker. He received his PhD in 1974 from the University of Michigan with a major in geology and vertebrate paleontology and a minor in ecology. His earlier studies were at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and space science and bachelor's of science in earth and space science and minor in zoology, and the University of Iowa with a master of science in geology and vertebrate paleontology and minor in museum studies. He was a research associate in the Department of Paleontology of the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution from 1975 until 2005. He is active in several professional and civic organizations, including past president of the Council of American Maritime Museums, founding vice president of the National Maritime Preservation Task Force of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, vice president for science and stewardship of the Maryland-Washington, D.C. chapter of the Nature Conservancy, co-chair of the Patuxent Riverkeeper Board of Trustees, American Association for Quaternary Environment, Society for the Historical Archaeology, and Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. Honors include Outstanding Young Men in America, I'm sure that was just last year, and Emerging Young Leaders in America. Now, this is not even saying, I haven't even mentioned that he was the executive director of the Calvert Marine Museum. I mean, just glossed right over that. His research interests have taken him to all continents. Now, listen to this list. I'm so jealous of most of them. There are a few of them I'm not sure if I'm jealous about. Iceland, Greenland, Labrador, Canadian High Arctic, Alaska, Mexico, the Caribbean, the Peruvian Amazon, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, Netherlands, England, and Russia. He served as geologist and historian on expedition adventure ships to the Antarctic, Arctic, Norway, Svalbard, Iceland, Falkland Islands, South Georgia, Greenland, Labrador, Newfoundland, Canadian Maritime Provinces, Great Lakes, Chile, Argentina, Mediterranean, Baltic, Japan, Azores, Canary Islands, and most of the major island groups of the South Pacific. Ellen, was he ever home? I swear. You know, to have such talent here in Southern Maryland is just incredible. We are so excited to hear you talking about a river that's really near and dear to our hearts. So welcome, Dr. Ralph Eshelman.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Nancy, for that very generous introduction. Tonight, I'm going to try to help you better appreciate the Patuxent River. And I suspect all of you already do. But I think hopefully when I get done, you'll have some new perspectives about the river that you might not have had before. So I'd like to start out with a couple of simple questions. How many of you live within the Patuxent watershed? A show of hands. How many of you live on the shores of the Patuxent River? Okay. How many of you don't know if you live within the watershed? You know, we laugh, but it's surprising how many people who live within the watershed and don't really understand that they're part of the watershed. I'll give you an example. People in Colombia, most of them have no idea that they're part of the Patuxent watershed. I had a friend, well, she's still a friend, but anyway, I was talking to her a couple of years ago. She lives in Brookville, which is New Hampshire Avenue extended from Washington, D.C. And we were talking about mills on the Howling River. And she did not know that that was a tributary of the Patuxent River. She had lived there for 20 years. So it's really amazing. And I'm going to, in a minute, show you a slide of the watershed so that you'll have a better appreciation of what it's all about. But It's an amazing river to me. So what I'd like to do is start out, number one, with this beautiful photograph. For those of you that are in the back, you probably can't see it very well. But what I like about it is this is the Patuxent River. And I don't know if you can make it out, but the name of that vessel is the Miss Patuxent. And that's the only vessel that I know of that had that particular name. There may be others, but how appropriate. Okay, let's make it work. What am I doing wrong? Do I need to point you that way? Okay. A few selected highlights of the Patuxent River. I'm going to start out with an article that was in the Calvert Recorder. That newspaper doesn't really exist anymore, but this is June 7, 2020, which is not that long ago, and I'll read it. And if I'm in your way, I apologize. It starts as a whisper near the four corners of Maryland, where Montgomery, Frederick, Howard, and Carroll counties converge. It's little more than a meandering brook winding its way through farmland. But when it completes its 100-mile journey to southern Maryland, the Patuxent River runs 120 feet, reaches 2 miles wide, and is the source of billions of dollars of industry, research, and recreation. That's a pretty startling statement made by an ordinary reporter for a newspaper here in southern Maryland. I do have two quibbles with what she had to say. And the first is that the Patuxent River is actually 115 miles. And you say, what's not a big difference, but 5 miles is a big difference. If we drew a line from where we are to now and we went due west, we'd be over in Calvert County. So 5 miles is big. The other difference is that the Patuxent River at its deepest point is 127 feet, not 120. So it really is truly an amazing river. I'm also going to read this to you. And this is a chapter out of a book, and it's called The Shores of the Patuxent. This was written in the 1930s. And again, you can follow along with me, but just the highlights that are in yellow. There is no established lore about the Patuxent River. It is little known. It has neither cult nor allure. It is the most sparsely inhabited and least known probably of all the rivers of tidewater of Maryland. It is not in the pathway of any flow of human life. That's a pretty amazing statement. Neither commerce nor tourism has disturbed it. It is indeed the least disturbed improved of any of the larger rivers on this side of the bay. This is not a particularly glowing statement about his chapter on the Patuxent River. And we're going to come back to this near the end of this presentation. This was written by Paul Wilstach, 1931. And just the title of his book might help you to understand where he was coming from. Tidewater, Maryland, its history, its tradition, its romantic plantation mansions, and the celebrated personages who gave it glamour. So he was really more interested in the high society type of people from Maryland, not necessarily the common folk, the farmers, the watermen that typically inhabit at least the southern portions of the Patuxent River. So this is the watershed. So everything that you see that is inside this slightly darkened area represents the watershed of the Patuxent River. And we're located way down here. So we're in, obviously, the southern portions of the Patuxent River watershed. I mentioned Columbia a little bit earlier. There's Columbia, Laurel. But right up here, this is the headwaters of the Patuxent River. And if you ever go on Interstate 70 from Baltimore to Frederick, you're going right over the headwaters of the Patuxent River. And how cool will it be if we could get the Federal Highway Department to put up signs that said something like, you are now entering the watershed of the Patuxent River. You are now leaving the headwaters of the Patuxent River, because most people that go along that interstate have no idea that they're actually in the Patuxent River, but indeed they are. I'm going to start out with one of these oh my kind of things that most of you probably have never heard of. And this has to do with Edward Drinker Cope. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that name, but Cope was a dinosaur hunter. He was with the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences, which is not that far from where we are. And he was in a war with another famous dinosaur guy by the name of Marsh. And they were trying to find the largest, the biggest, the most important dinosaurs anywhere in the world. And they were in competition with each other. But Cope also came and collected in the Patuxent watershed. Do you guys know that there are dinosaurs that have been found in the Patuxent watershed? If you go up near Meerkork, which is where an iron mine was located, the first significant dinosaur ever found in North America came from the Patuxent watershed. A little known fact. The reason I'm showing this picture of him and this image of this particular jaw here with teeth in it, this is a mustelid. You're familiar with weasels. This is a fossil weasel that was collected from Delabrook Manor in Charles County. And this particular specimen, if you look at the tag up here, you can clearly see Patuxent River, Charles County. So these are some of the kinds of fossils that have been found in the Patuxent River that most people don't even think about. I think most of you know that I'm writing a book, a comprehensive book about the Patuxent River. One chapter is just on the fossils of the Patuxent River. And it's amazing. Fossils from the Patuxent River are in institutions throughout the world because of the significance of the fossils that are found here. I was very fortunate to go to England and visit Oxford, visit London, and where was the third place I went of?
Cambridge.
Where?
Cambridge.
Cambridge, to their museums of natural history, looking at specimens that had been collected in the Patuxent River that are in their collections. And you might think, why would that happen? And the reason is that if you go back to the early colonial times, the clergy who were appointed to come to the colonies were also partially selected, not just on their ability to be good clergy, but also their knowledge of natural history. And the reason for that is that the mother country wanted to learn more about their colonies, no matter where that colony was. And so these clergymen were asked to collect and send material back to their mother country. So the first fossils collected in the Patuxent River were collected by clergymen that ended up in the collections in England and other places around the world. I mean, it's just amazing. This is a mastodon tooth. For those of you that are close enough to be able to read it, you can see that this was collected in St. Mary's County. And the significance of this tooth is that based on the identification that we've been able to determine, it came from a mill site. And we know that the mill site was somewhere between the Potomac and the Patuxent watershed. We're not exactly clear, but we think it was probably in the Patuxent watershed. But we have other mastodon teeth collected by the same individual, and you might be able to read his name. It's J. Varden. That's John Varden. The significance of John Varden is that he started the first museum in Washington, D.C., and he charged people to come into it. And he went all through Southern Maryland collecting fossils and other things that he put on display. This is one of the mastodon teeth that he collected in Southern Maryland and put on display in his personal museum. When the Smithsonian Institution became established in Washington, D.C., it put him out of business because the institution was free and he was charging money. No one was going to pay money to go to a museum when you could go to one that was free. But they also needed collections, the early years of the Smithsonian. So they bought Varden's collections and made him one of the first curators. So what I'm explaining to you is that Varden's collection formed the core of the first collections for the Smithsonian Institution. And among those specimens were specimens from the Patuxent River. Who knew? This is just a little bit more about him. The name of his museum was the Washington Museum of Curiosities. You know, back in the early days, museums were considered cabinets of curiosities. We don't use that term today, but they did back then. Now, this is kind of unusual. What you're looking at here are diatoms. If you're not familiar with diatoms, they're actually plants. And what's interesting about these particular plants is that they have a shell covering that's made out of silica. And these are microscopic. It's almost like a pillbox. So you have two sides to it. And the animal, the plant, lives inside of this little shell. And there's many, many different species of these. It just so happens that on the Patuxent River, the first commercial excavation of diatomite in the United States, Patuxent River, up at Lions Creek. We're not exactly sure how this happened, but this particular gentleman by the name of John Barnett, he was a master in England to make slides and lantern slides that were used for educational purposes, primarily in England. And what you're looking at here is a lantern slide that would have been used in universities back in those days. And that's where you actually had a flame that was behind the lantern and it would be projected out onto a screen. That's what the projectors were like back in that day. And this shows diatoms from the Patuxent in Maryland. We don't know the exact date of this, but we suspect it's around the 1860s, 1870s. If you look over at the right, this is a microscope slide, also with diatoms from the Patuxent. And you might be able to make out right up there, it says Patuxent diatoms. How did this happen? How did this guy in England, who never came to the United States, end up with diatoms that came from the Patuxent River? We don't know exactly, but we have a pretty good idea. And we think what happened is that this fellow down here, Lewis Woodman, he was a curator at the Wagner Free Institute in Philadelphia. The Wagner Free Institute was established in the 1820s. And we know that he traded materials from America with this guy in England. And they have specimens at the Wagner Institute, such as the one that you're looking at right here. You can see it says Lions Creek, diatomaceous earth, and it was collected by the same gentleman. So if you put two and two together, this is speculation, but it seems very likely that he sent the samples collected from the Patuxent River to England that then became lantern slides and microscopic slides that were used for educational and research purposes. These are some photographs of what that diatomaceous earth mine would have looked like in its later years. It operated up until the 1960s. And in addition to the diatomite, they also quarried what was called green sands. And green sands are little nodules of a greenish sand that was very high, particularly in potassium and nitrogen. And that was used as a fertilizer. So in Baltimore, they brought in the green sand from the Patuxent River and they formed their own company and they named it the Patuxent Fertilizer Company. Who knew? Let's take a different slant a little bit. Let's take a look at some of the environmental aspects of the Patuxent River that a lot of people don't think about. On the left, this is Battle Creek Cypress Swamp. I hope all of you have been there. You probably already know that Battle Creek Cypress Swamp is the northernmost significant stand of cypress on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. If you go on the eastern shore, there's a stand that's slightly further to the north, but on the western shore, this is the northernmost significant stand. I say significant because for those of you that are familiar with Sixes Road, if you ever take Sixes Road, there's actually a stand of cypress there that is even further north than Battle Creek Cypress Swamp, just for clarification purposes. Over on the right is the Hemlock Preserve. This is property that was bought by the Nature Conservancy back in the 60s. And the reason they bought it is that this was the southernmost distribution of eastern hemlock on the entire coastal plain of the United States. So the significance of what I'm showing you here, and we have a map that's kind of hard to see, but if you look right down there, you can see Battle Creek cypress swamp, and right down there, you can see the hemlock preserve. So what I'm saying to you is that this particular portion of the Patuxent River is where you have two ecotones that are overlapping one another, southernmost distributions and northernmost distributions. What that means is that the species numbers in between these two ecotones is higher than it is further to the north and further to the south. It also means, however, that the cypress, because it's at the extremes of its tolerance, is probably not going to do so well with climate change. Now, because climate change is getting warmer, that's probably good for cypress. On the other hand, think about hemlock. This is the southernmost distribution for hemlock. So the future of the hemlock in this preserve are probably not very good. But it's interesting to me that here in the Patuxent River, we have this kind of a dichotomy, and you don't have this anywhere else in the state of Maryland, only in the Patuxent River. Tobacco. I think all of you know the significance of tobacco. What you may not realize is how important the Patuxent River was to the production of tobacco in the colony of Maryland. And I think you can read the dates, 1689 all the way down to 1701. And everything that's inside that red bracket is the number of hogsheads per year of tobacco that were shipped out of this watershed. And if you compare those numbers with all of the other rivers like the Potomac, the Pocomoke, and then places like Annapolis, Cecil County, et cetera, you'll see that there's no other place that comes even close to what the Patuxent was doing. So that means if you had a plantation in the Patuxent, particularly the tidal portion of the Patuxent, this was the gold mine for tobacco. These were the best soils you could possibly get for tobacco. Sotterley is an example of that. There we go. How many of you know that this is a plantation house that once existed near the mouth of the Patuxent River? It's called Elton Head. And in 1925, it was in derelict condition. And the Baltimore Museum of Art came to Calvert County, took out the wall paneling, and it's now installed in their museum. So here's a plantation house with significant wall paneling on display in Baltimore, and very few people that even live in this area have ever seen it or gone to Baltimore to take a look at it. Here's another example. There we go. This is the paneling from Patuxent Manor. This is in Calvert County. This is at Lower Marlboro. And off to the right, you can see what that particular plantation house looks like. This is the paneling that was inside that house that was taken to Winterthur in Delaware. And you can go to Winterthur, and they have two different rooms. They have a bedroom, and they have the lower main entertaining room. They have the paneling from both of those rooms on exhibit at Winterthur. So those are two plantation houses. One is still extant, one is completely demolished, but the paneling from them are on display in other parts of the country. And then finally, when the Navy came in where the Naval Air Base is located today, historians pointed out to the government that there was a historic house there. They thought this house by the name of Susquehanna, which is kind of confusing because a lot of people don't understand how you could have that name on the Patuxent. But at that time, they thought this was probably a colonial house. And so the government offered it to any other museum that would be willing to take it. Who took it? The Ford Museum. in Detroit. And so that house was moved, and you can see it in the bottom, what it looks like today. And if you've ever been up to see the Ford Museum, this is one of the many historic homes that they have. Recent dendrochronology indicates that the actual age of that is 1830s. So it's kind of a disappointment to some people, but still it's a significant house. If you're ever in Detroit around the holidays, they have an amazing Christmas outdoor production that they do up there. And you can go inside that house and quote unquote, they have what they refer to as a traditional Chesapeake Christmas dinner. And what's sitting in the middle of the big table? A lobster. I'm not kidding you. They really don't know what a Chesapeake. Yeah. Now, this is another one that's amazing. How many of you knew that there was an iron forge on the Patuxent River? It was operated by the Snowdens. So we're talking about the upper reaches of the Patuxent watershed. And they made pig iron. And if you're not familiar with that term, they would take bog iron, and then melt it down and form pigs. And they're called pigs because you would have a main channel where the molten iron would come out into, and then in the sand, they would make these grooves, then would become these pigs. And the reason they made them that particular size is so that a man could pick them up by himself. Generally, they weighed between 60 to 80 pounds. So that made them maneuverable. And so what the iron furnace did is they would make pig iron, and then they would sell it to other places where it could be remelted down and then cast into anything that you wanted it to be, frying pans, stoves, whatever. Where did most of the pig iron from the Patuxent River go to? It went to England. England needed iron for their industry. We didn't have a great need for that in the beginning of the early years here in the Patuxent River area. Here's the amazing thing. On these pig irons, when they were cast, they had the name Patuxent and the year that the pigs were cast. These would have been shipped on board merchant vessels as ballast. You wouldn't want to have those sitting up on the deck. We're talking about a lot of heavy weight. So when one of these vessels wrecks, archaeologists go down, and lo and behold, they find Patuxent pigs. And we know of 4 shipwrecks that have Patuxent pigs on them. And one of them is from the Sulu Sea, that's near the Philippines. One of them is from the British Channel on the French side, and 2 of them come from Canada. So the reason I'm pointing this out to you is just think about Patuxent pig iron was essentially all over the world. And who knows what other shipwrecks might turn up with these kind of things. So these are examples of them. If you want to see an actual example, Parks Canada sent one of their pig irons to the Calvert Marine Museum, and it's on exhibit there. So you can go take a look at it. This is a drawing of what it looks like, so you can see that embossment better, and you can see the dates. And then this is the shipwreck of the French wreck. And everything that you see here that's kind of in brown, all of these little brown things out here, that's all pig iron. This ship was loaded with pig iron, and all of it was only 2 dates, 1737 and 1736. Okay, a big jump. Star Spangled Banner. That's a big jump from pig iron. How many people understand that really the Star Spangled Banner had its beginning in the Patuxent River? We all tend to think of it as, hey, that's part of Fort McHenry. Francis Scott Key saw the bombardment of Fort McHenry. But what a lot of people don't realize, I see this gentleman shaking his head, is that it really began when the British landed on the Patuxent to march on Washington, D.C. And when they went through Upper Marlboro, they befriended a doctor up there by the name of Dr. Beans. And then they went on to Washington. As you know, quote unquote, you'll hear everyone say they burnt the city. That's not true. They burnt many of the government buildings. How many of you know that the American Navy and the American Army burned more buildings in Washington, D.C. to keep them out of the British hands than the British burnt? It's true. I did a paper on it. You can find it online. Nevertheless, when they came back, there were some stragglers, and they were captured by Dr. Beans and some of his friends, and they were put in a smokehouse. I pretty much know what smokehouse that is, and it's in deteriorating condition, unfortunately. One of them escaped, got back to the British line, told them that there were other British soldiers that were being held. They sent cavalry back. They arrested Dr. Beans, and they said to him, if you do not release those captives, we're going to burn your town at noontime. So what choice did you have? So they released them. What they didn't realize is that Dr. Beans was also taken with them to their ships in Benedict because they didn't want him to be able to tell anybody what was going on. This precipitated James Madison to try to seek someone to come down to seek the release of Dr. Beans. So who did they send? Francis Scott Key was an attorney. That was one of them. The other one was Stuart Skinner. I don't know if you've ever heard of Stuart Skinner, but Stuart Skinner lived in Calvert County, and he was the agent for prisoner exchange. If you're going to send a team to try to seek the release, those are two good people to have. So they went on a truce ship under a white flag, ran down the British fleet, explained what they wanted to do. The British officers agreed that they would be released, but only after they completed their attack on Baltimore, because they did not want them to be able to tell the Americans what they were up to. That is the genesis of the Star-Spangled Banner. It started on the Patuxent River. Star-Spangled Banner, we all know that term. What does it mean? Take a look at that flag. Take a look at the stars on the first row. Can you see that they're crooked? They lean in one direction. Take a look at the second row. Those stars lean in the opposite direction. That is the Star-Spangled Banner. No other flag in American history was spangled. Now you know the genesis of how that all came about. I won't bother you with a lot of people refer to it as a poem. Technically, it was not a poem. It was the lines to a song known as Anacreon in Heaven. And that's what became the Star-Spangled Banner. It was not a poem. Many, many wars on the Patuxent River. I'm going to jump right now into the Civil War. We could go into World War I. We could do the Puritan Wars. There's so many wars you could talk about. There were even the Indian Wars that took place on the Patuxent River. Camp Stanton. I think most of you are familiar with Camp Stanton. Named after the secretary. Located in Benedict. And this is where if a slave owner was willing to sell their slave to the Union would buy them. On the other hand, the Union went around to different plantation homes and ordered them to release their slaves. And I don't have the time to go into the story of what happened up at around the Benedict area, but there was actually an individual that a Union officer who got killed. His last name was Ellsworth. I'm named after him. My full name is Ralph Eshelman, and he became a battle cry during the Civil War from the Union side. His name was Lieutenant Ellsworth. Another long story, don't have time to get into it. This is one of only 2 photographs that we know of Camp Stanton. And I think you can clearly see there's 2 Union officers. You can see their uniforms. You can see 2 blacks, and there's actually a third guy in the back, but it's so dark you really can't make him out. The Maryland Historical Trust, as we speak, is trying to do some investigation to find where the cemetery is for Camp Stanton. We know where a lot of the buildings were located, but they don't know exactly where the cemetery is located. But we know that from disease and from natural death causes, over 100 of these African Americans who left slavery to become a soldier in the Union Army are buried there. So I'd just like for you to think a minute that in one 24-hour period, there could be an individual who was a slave. And at the end of that day, he could be at Camp Stanton. And then he's learning how to use a musket to fight against potentially the master that he served under. And that exact same thing that I'm describing to you also happened in the War of 1812. It's estimated that over 4,000 slaves were freed by the British when they came up and down the Patuxent and the Potomac. And the exact same thing happened under different circumstances. A lot of other people don't realize that so many bridges located between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., that Southern sympathizers would try to tear those bridges up to make it difficult for the trains to operate. So that meant that the Union actually sent out troops to guard all of these different bridges that went over the Patuxent River. And what you're looking at here is an artist's description of one of those bridges that went over one of the branches of the Patuxent River. And I could show you plans of different Union fortifications that were used to protect different bridges that went over the Patuxent River. That's all in the Civil War chapter of the book. Steamboats. How can you talk about the Patuxent River without steamboats? It's amazing to me, but on this map in red, every one of those red letters you see over there represents a steamboat wharf. There was no place in the tidal portion of the Patuxent River where you were more than 5 miles from a steamboat wharf. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal. In one instance, on St. Leonard's Creek, there were 2 steamboat wharfs, one on the opposite sides of the creek. Why would they do that? St. Leonard's Creek penetrated almost the entire peninsula of Calvert County. It was very difficult for someone on one side to get to the other side except by boat. So they decided to build a steamboat wharf on both sides. And when the steamboat came into Makel's Landing, which is on the north side, it didn't bother to turn around. It backed into the wharf at Sollers. And then from there, it was ready to head right straight out into the Patuxent River. A little known fact, if I get going too long here, you guys can put out the cut sign. There were only 3 known wharf stores left in the entire Chesapeake Bay as of 3 months ago. One of them was recently demolished. 2 of the 3 were located on St. Leonard's Creek. The one at Sollers Wharf is now gone. The only one that is left is on the Makel side, at Makel's Wharf. And here's a little story for you. When I first came down to be the director of the Calvert Marine Museum, my first main job was to move the Drum Point Lighthouse. And we had an old stove that we wanted to put in the lighthouse because that's what they would have used for heating. And we needed stove polish. Well, back in those days, we're talking about the mid-70s, you didn't have internet. You had the telephone. And you'd call up people and you say, where can I get stove polish? And the answer that came back every time was, go to Makel's store at Makel's Wharf. So we're talking about in the 70s, and the products were still on the shelves of that store. And we walked in, Mabel Makel was her name, walked in, she said, here you go. And there were probably about 50 bottles of stove polish. She said, take as many as you want. The store had been closed for years. But it's just amazing stories like that. That's where people went to do this kind of stuff. Today, you'd be going to the shopping center. You wouldn't be going to the store at the wharf. And by the way, the store at the wharf is where the post office was usually also. Your mail was coming by the steamboat. Different time, different days. I just thought I'd show you a steamboat wharf at Sotterley. I'm happy to tell you that the photographic collection that Sotterley has amazing shots of the wharf here. And to my knowledge, other than Solomon's Wharf, There's no other wharf that's photographically as well documented as is Sotterley Wharf. And in my book, thanks to Sotterley, I have a special kind of pictorial summary of all the different things that went on at that particular wharf, an amazing wharf. Here's another story for you. This is an oyster can label. And from where you are located, you probably can't read it very well. But if you look over here, you might be able to make out San Francisco, California. And if you look over here, you might be able to make out Solomon's Island, Maryland. What the heck is going on here? This is the label off of an oyster can that was found in a gold mine outside of San Francisco. These were oysters that were canned in Solomon's at the Solomon's oyster plant. They were then shipped to California. Some gold miner bought a can of oysters to take into the mine, had lunch, threw the empty can into a corner, and because of the environment inside that mine that was relatively dry with constant temperature and whatnot, no rats or anything apparently ever came in and nibbled on it. This label and the can survived, and it's now in the collections at the Calvert Marine Museum. What an amazing story. And so my question to you is, how did that can get there? And you could speculate that it came down through the Isthmus of Panama. There was no canal in those days, so you had to then go by train and then get on another ship and come on around. Or you could have come all the way down around the Cape Horn. More likely it went by train right across the continent of the United States to San Francisco. But how many oyster houses anywhere in the United States can claim that they had oysters that they canned on the east coast of the United States that ended up in San Francisco? I don't think there's another oyster house that can claim that. And I'll throw another one out for you. At the J. Sealor Oyster House, which is the last oyster house to operate on the Patuxent River, they sold oysters that went to Antarctica. Now you might say, how the heck did that happen? All you have to do is look across the river. Patuxent Naval Air Station. Patuxent Naval Air Station supplied the aircraft that took most of the researchers and all of the building materials to go to Antarctica to build Little America. That was the research laboratory that was being sponsored by the United States. So Patuxent River played a role in that, and they decided to throw some oysters in there for special occasions like maybe New Year's or maybe Christmas. And where do? You go across the river to the J. Sealor Oyster House. It's just amazing things like that. Who would have ever thought? The largest dry dock in the world was tested at the mouth of the Patuxent River. And what you're looking at here, this is the dry dock in 1905. It was built in Bethlehem Steel, Baltimore. They didn't have water depths up there deep enough to test it. This was designed to be able to accommodate a battleship. So they came to the mouth of the Patuxent River, where, remember, the water depth is up to 127 feet. And what you see here is the battleship Iowa going inside the dry dock. And then they pump out the water out of these big tanks right here, which allow it to come up. And then you can do work on the bottom hull of the vessel. This was built for the Pacific Fleet. Bethlehem Steel got the contract. It was tested at the mouth of the Patuxent River, and then it was towed all the way to the Philippines to serve the Pacific Fleet for the U.S. Navy. And guess what? It survived World War I, and at the end of World War II, it was decommissioned. Pretty amazing. Speaking about World War II, Johnny's going to be giving a talk tomorrow about what happened over at the Navy base, if you're interested. It'll be at the Chesapeake building at Leonardtown, at the community. What you're looking at here is the development of the Naval Amphibious Base that was established. The irony of this is that men who trained in Solomon's Island ended up landing on the Solomon Islands in the Pacific. That's a pretty amazing. I mean, no other place can you say that. But think about what it did to all of the farms and the people that lived in that area. They were given a couple of months and they had to move out. This whole thing was completely transformed into this amazing base. And this is one of the few things that survives today is the Century Gates. If you ever go into Calvert Marina, which by the way it's just been sold. There's going to be a new owner over there. So these are the kind of things that were taking place. They say Solomon's, but it was really at Cove Point, not technically the Patuxent River. So the men who were training here were doing exactly the same thing when they landed at Normandy and a lot of the Pacific Islands and whatnot. Just an amazing story. This is the Patuxent Naval Air Station. I just wanted to show it to you for the simple reason that what you see down here, these are hangars. These were hangars for seaplanes. These were built in 1943. And these are considered architecturally and engineering marvel. And they're now National Historic Landmarks. These were going to be torn down. But because they now are considered National Historic Landmarks, they've been preserved. So what you're looking at there are remnants of World War II for seaplanes that were operating at the mouth of the Patuxent River. If you ever go to the Air and Space Museum, the one particularly over at Dulles Airport, you'll see many planes that are on display there that were tested at Patuxent Naval Air Station because it was a test and evaluation. It was also a pilot school, but it was started out as a test and evaluation airport. And so any planes that were captured by the enemy, this is where they would be taken to be analyzed. And they're still doing testing of aircraft at Patuxent Naval Air Station. This happens to be a German plane that had been captured. There we go. Don't worry, I'm not going to read this. This is a list of some of the over 90 Patuxent test pilots that went into the astronauts school. And just some of the names that everybody's familiar with: Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Scott Kelly. I mean, the list is amazing. I'll just leave it at that. But this is part of the history of Patuxent River that people who live here, oftentimes we don't appreciate that. You remember the restaurant where they had all of the hats from the different pilots that they would live there, the Roost? You know, I mean, it's things like that that I remember, and I regret that they're not there anymore. How are we doing on time? I can cut this anytime you want. Imagine a river where movie stars would come just to kind of get away from everything. So here's Bowen's Inn that was located in Solomon's. Do you know that people like Arthur Godfrey, he used to love to go to Bowen's Inn. And he would love to pick up his ukulele and sing and entertain the people. I just remember taco night on Thursday. It was $1 a taco. Robert Mitchum used to live over on the Eastern Shore. Robert Mitchum would come all the way across the Chesapeake Bay to go to Bowen's Inn and go to White Sands, just to kind of get away, where hopefully nobody knew who he was and he wouldn't be pestered. How about John Pierpont Morgan's yacht, the Corsica 3, coming into the Patuxent River? Can you imagine something like that? And why did Morgan do that? Because he wanted to visit his daughter, who lived here at Sotterley. And the story goes that one of the yawl boats that they had on board, he gave to his daughter. And here at Sotterley, they built a shed particularly for it. Anybody know what happened to that yawl boat? It seems to have disappeared. But how cool would that be for Sotterley to have that yawl boat to tell part of that story? I mean, it's amazing. It's just amazing. Railbird hunting. How many people even know what a railbird is? Skinny as a rail? It's because the bird is so narrow because it needs to get through the marshes. That's what skinny as a rail means. But it was a type of bird. People would come to the Patuxent to hunt railbirds. You wouldn't believe. You had to have a pusher's license. You know, today we think of drugs. We don't think of pusher's license. But back then you had to have a pusher's license to legally take people out and go railbird hunting. And so who are some of the people that railbirded hunting right here on the Patuxent River? Can you recognize them? It's Babe Ruth on the right. Who's that in the middle? Theodore Roosevelt. And on the left, General Patton. Yeah. So, you know, we're so close to Washington, D.C., it was easy for those folks to come down here. And they love to do that kind of stuff. So this is Franklin D. Roosevelt. He used to come down to the Patuxent Hunt Club all the time. The Patuxent Hunt Club is located up near, I call it Hills Landing, where the Route 24 bridge goes across the Patuxent River. And this is in the day book, where they did a little cartoon because he happened to be there. But he used to come down all the time and visit the Patuxent River. He used to fish on the river. He used to hunt on the river. How about Kennedy? His favorite sailing vessel was the Manitou. The Manitou was built at the M.M. Davis shipyard in Solomons, Maryland. And it ended up at the Harry Lundenberg School of Seamanship over on the Potomac, and now it's in private hands. But a vessel built here on the river became his favorite sailing vessel, and they referred to it as kind of like his sailing White House. How about the M.M. Davis shipyard? This is the first shipyard that came up with the idea of a conveyor belt in the construction of vessels, similar to what Ford did for the automobile. It was an assembly line. And this was designed for the general, normal, average income family in the United States, not for the rich, for the general, normal person. And they would advertise by bringing in people that I don't need to tell you who these folks are. But they would do that on the I Love Lucy show. They would advertise the cruise along. They also had a show in one of the boat sales offices in Philadelphia. They had one on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And over on the right, that is a cruise along that they hauled all the way to Lake Titicaca. That's Bolivia. And they did that as a promotion to advertise to the world, here's a cruise along on the highest navigable lake in the world, made at M.M. Davis. Imagine what it cost them to get that thing up there. How many lighthouses did it take to get into the mouth of the Patuxent River? How many do you think? You can think of two, Drum Point, Cedar Point, but Cove Point also served a role. If you were coming down the bay, Cove Point was the first one to let you know you're getting close to the Patuxent River. So there's Cove Point. This is the oldest active lighthouse in Maryland today. There's Drum Point. I love this photograph. This is the lighthouse being moved. And what you're looking at is a steam-operated crane. You can see the firebox right there. That flame is from the firebox. That's a 110-foot crane. What would a crane like that be doing here in the Patuxent River? It was building the Solomons Bridge. This was 1975, 1976. The bridge opened in December of 1977. And this was the lighthouse that replaced it right there. I kind of like the old lighthouse better. I'm kind of running out of time, I think. But how many of you know that there were 3 submarines that operated at the mouth of the Patuxent River? This one is kind of an amazing looking thing, but this was designed by Simon Lake. If you're familiar with that name, he was a major inventor of some of the earliest submarines, and it was built Bethlehem steel. So built in Bethlehem steel, you know darn well it's going to come down to Solomons. And here's what it looked like. It had a snorkel to go up for the exhaust pipe of the engine. It also had an air pipe. So what it meant was that this was a submersible that never was designed to be completely able to go under the water. It still had to be in relatively shallow water so that you could have exhaust and get air to come in. But what you're looking at right here is a door where a hard hat diver could come out. And then you see these big wheels? Those wheels were designed for it to move along the bottom. It was not designed to propel itself with propellers. It was designed to move along the bottom. And this is a map that came out of McClure's magazine in the 1880s and 1890s. And here you can see Baltimore. Here's the trip that it took out to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and then on its way back, it stopped at Solomon's. When it stopped at Solomon's, it laid the first underwater cable across the mouth of the Patuxent River. And it also found 2 shipwrecks out there. This is another example. This is Gilbert Klingel. He was a founding member of the Natural History Society of Maryland, and he befriended the researchers at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory in Solomon's. And they decided to build this submersible, I guess you could call it, from which they took the first underwater photographs of animal life in the Patuxent River. Unfortunately, that no longer exists. All we have left are essentially photographs. How about during World War I? These were captured German ocean liners. The United States had nothing that they really could use them for after the war, so they mothballed them at the mouth of the Patuxent River, and they referred to as the Ghost Fleet. Notice the cows in the water. The men who were assigned to that fleet to maintain those ships were kind of bored. So they came up with the idea that they learned there was going to be a national lifeboat race held in New York Harbor. So they decided to take one of their lifeboats off one of their vessels, and they practiced rowing. And they went to the competition, and Albert Zanizer, this is not the Skip Zanizer, this is Skip's father we're talking about. He was one of the ones that was part of that team. And their team won 2 gold medals and 2 silver medals over 5 years of competition. And what you're looking at the right is his tombstone at the Methodist Church Cemetery in Solomon's. And on his tombstone is a replica of the gold medal that he got. That's how much that meant to him.
So can you go back one, 2 slides? What happened to the boats that were mothballed?
The boats that were mothballed, one by one, they were eventually either sold or unfortunately taken out and scuttled. Yeah. There's a lot of furniture that have ended up in some of the homes down in the Solomon's area, little souvenirs and things like that over the years kind of got taken off the boats. It's an interesting story in itself. I'm not going to go into any detail here, but I just wanted to emphasize to you that there have been painters, there have been writers, there have been poets that have been inspired by the Patuxent River. If you guys know Tom Wisner, he was the poet laureate for Maryland. He lived on the Patuxent River. He was inspired by the river. Other people that we could talk about is William Hobart Footner. Hobart Footner wrote over 150 different books. Many of his books talked about different aspects of the Patuxent River. I mean, if you ever read any of his books, they're amazing. And he has this sense of humor. I really would encourage people to read some of his books. How about artwork? Well, James Michener wrote about the Patuxent River and also the naval base in his book Space. The first chapter, that's what it's all about. If you haven't read it, go take a look at it. This is Benjamin Henley Latrobe, an engineer, amazing guy. This is his sketch of Marlborough Mill. This was sketched in 1813. This is the earliest illustration we know of any painting or sketch that was ever done in the Patuxent. 1813 is not that early, but that's the earliest that I'm aware of. That's the Ghost Fleet again. Why am I showing it to you again? This is the cover that was used in Fortune magazine, September 1936. Did you guys ever hear of Max Weil? He was an artist that lived in Washington, D.C. And these are two paintings that he's done of the marshes of the Patuxent River. These are the only two that I know of. How many more he did, I don't know. But what you're looking at down below is an exhibit that was done at the Corcoran Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. And if you look at those images up close with a magnifying glass, almost half of them involve marshes. Now, some of them are probably Potomac, but a lot of them are also probably Patuxent River. But these two up here, we know definitely are Patuxent River because it says it on the back. And we're moving along here quickly. Mr. Patuxent, a lot of people referred to Bernie Fowler as Mr. Patuxent. And he's the guy that started the wade-in, where he remembered when he was just a youngster, he could look down with his sneakers and he could see his toes. Back in the days when you could go out with a crab net and pull up soft crab shells, crabs. So he came up with this idea of doing a wade-in to measure the depth of the water as to how deep the water would be before he could not see his shoes. This is not a scientific experiment at all, but what it did is it brought recognition of the plight of the Patuxent River. And I don't know how many people here know that the Southern Three Marylands sued the Department of Environment and all of the counties in the northern part of the watershed. And they won their suit. So this was the beginning of kind of the environmental movement on the Patuxent River. And I'm kind of moving along here. I wanted to just show this to you. I know you probably can't read it, but down at the bottom, you can probably read that. This is the minutes from 1935 of the Neighbors Club of Sandy Spring in Montgomery County. Sandy Spring is right on the border between the Potomac and the Patuxent watersheds. And what it's requesting is for the health officer of the county to let them know if they thought it was safe for them to swim in the Patuxent River. So we're talking about 1935. And the reply that they got back is the officer said, the Patuxent is polluted, but the danger of swimming is not very great. That's 1935. I wonder if you asked the health officer today what they would say. I'm almost at the end. Anybody recognize that place? Do you recognize this? That's a stone pile. This is fossil rock. There's fossils in there all over the place, all kinds of shells. And this is all part of what's called the Chop Tank Formation. In Calvert Cliffs, we're all familiar with that. There's 3 different formations. Along the Patuxent River, all 3 of those formations outcrop. Right where we are at Sotterley and over at St. Leonard's Creek, the Chop Tank Formation outcrops. And in the Chop Tank Formation, there's a limestone. And that limestone has all of these fossils in it. And so if I were to do a tour of Sotterley, I would always include that because it's different. Most people don't think of that. You're here for history, not necessarily about fossils. But no doubt, I would say that slaves probably went down, collected those rocks, brought them up, and this was used to help secure the terrace that was located there. And you can also notice there's a couple of places where it almost looks like they had a little bit of a buttress that came out to try to help stabilize it so that it wouldn't fall. But you can go right down to Sotterley Creek and you can see these same fossils. You can go and look at slave cabin sites particularly over at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, and the foundations are made out of the same stone. We didn't have native building stone here. So to have this kind of a rock, this was kind of like an asset. And then I wanted to leave this with you. Did anybody recognize that? You might know a little bit about that. This is the smokehouse here at Sotterley. And the reason I'm showing it to you is that this is very rare. That is a tree trunk that's been cut and hollowed out and turned into a brine trough. So in the meat house, smokehouse, this is where the meat would have been put into the salt brine to help preserve it. And the reason I'm showing it to you is that in the entire Patuxent watershed, I only know of one other log brine trunk like that, and that's at Compton Bassett. I don't know if you're familiar with Compton Bassett. Compton Bassett is when you go across the Route 4 bridge into Prince George's County, on the right-hand side, Compton Bassett is a plantation up there. It belongs to Maryland National Capital Park and Planning, but the gate is always locked. But if you park in front of the gate, which they probably wouldn't be too happy about, but I do it all the time, you can walk in. I mean, it's public property, but you can walk in, and in the smokehouse, you can see another one of these. I do not know of another one anywhere in the Patuxent watershed. To me, this is a very special artifact. And I just wonder, I don't know how close this was to the bark side of that tree, but based on the shape, it looks to me like you're getting close. So if you did a dendrochronology, you probably would get an age that's relatively close to the age of what that would be. Just something to think about. Okay, I know we've covered a lot, and I think that's about it. I just wanted to go back to that first slide. You remember this terrible statement that Will Statch made against the Patuxent River? What I didn't show you is that down at the bottom, he said, but the Patuxent has its points of interest. It is well worth knowing. And I hope all of you might agree. So with that, I will close. Thank you all very much.
Okay, so we will have time for some questions. Now, first, let me say I am so remiss. I did not thank our wonderful, I was so excited that you were here. I just lost my mind. We want to thank Toyota Southern Maryland for sponsoring this event. And this season, we've had such incredible sponsors. So thank you, Toyota Southern Maryland. Absolutely. But I would love to be able to take your questions. And so the people online can hear the questions. What I will do is I will come around and bring the microphone to you. So just let me know if you have questions. And Catherine, you'll let me know if we have any online as well, correct? Yeah. Okay. Anybody have questions? I'm coming to you.
Can I stay seated?
Yes.
A little bit offline, but how were the oysters pasteurized to get to and then canned?
You're asking a good question.
I knew that.
When oysters were first harvested, they would be shucked and they would be sold raw. And that meant that you didn't have much shelf life. So in Baltimore, they came up with this idea similar to what Napoleon came up with, which was to steam the oysters and then hermetically seal them. Initially, it was done in a glass jar. But in Baltimore, they came up with the idea of putting them in tins and then hermetically sealing them with solder. And then over time, they perfected better ways to do that. But to make a long story short, the oysters would be cleaned, put in the cans with a hole in it, and then they would be steamed to pasteurize them, and then they would seal that hole. And that meant that the oysters, as long as there wasn't any disruption in any of those seams, could probably last for months, if maybe even a year. Now, how tasty they would have been, I don't know. But
Plus, the solder was probably lead.
probably.
In Cambridge, they emptied out an old warehouse, and what it was metal cans, the Todd packing house. They're about this big. They're just galvanized, and 1 gallon would go in one of those packed in ice.
Right.
And then they would be packed in a car with straw and river ice.
And ice.
And,
Yeah. And so oysters like that could then be shipped by steamboat. So that was the big advantage. So the oysters that made it to Antarctica, those were canned.
Marcia, come to you. Just a second.
What's the current state of the water quality of the Patuxent River?
Loaded question. What's the present state of the water quality in the Patuxent River?
So can you repeat
There's-
the question, because I don't think everybody heard it. Can you repeat the question for
The question was, what is the present status of the water quality in the Patuxent River? And some of the recent research has made some startling new understanding of what's going on. And that is that due to climate change, there's more rain. So there's more rainfall, more runoff from the land. It used to be that the scientists thought that most of the pollution was coming from elsewhere, such as from the mouth of the river, from the Chesapeake Bay. But now it appears that most of it's coming from runoff. The other problem with climate change is that with temperatures rising, that makes it more difficult for oxygen to stay in the water. So it's a compounding effect. If you have more runoff of nutrient, and a lot of that nutrient then feeds things like different types of plants that take up the oxygen, then you have less oxygen in the water. So they used to think that a lot of the issues were outside the basin, although they understood that sewage there's over 30 major sewage treatment plants in the Patuxent River. 3 of them are considered major plants. I could go on and give you details, but there's also some trailer parks, like up near Wason's Corner, where they have their own water treatment plants. When I say water treatment, I'm talking about sewage treatment. And they recently discovered through the Patuxent River Keeper that those plants have been illegally dumping raw sewage into those rivers, into our river. So the effort currently is to try to get these smaller treatment plants under control because they've not been doing a good job. The larger plants do a good job, but here's the big problem. Whenever you have a storm, it overwhelms the treatment plant. They can't handle it. And so that means all of that raw sewage is coming right down the river. And I'm going to go out on a limb here because I don't know how much time you have, but back when we were working on the Barney Flotilla, the War of 1812 flotilla, that was up near above Wason's Corner. All of the divers that dove were coming up with sore throats, ear aches, and stuff like that. And so we started looking into what's going on here. And what we discovered is that about 60% of the water flowing down at that time, I'm talking about the late 70s, was sewage effluent. And so what they were doing is they were putting earplugs in, stuff like that, to try to take care of that aspect. The other was siltation. The regulator would clog up because of the siltation. When you go down and as soon as you hit the bottom of the Patuxent, all of the silt would just come up and the visibility would be almost zero. So what they would do is they would take women's nylon stockings and put it around the regulator. They would cut it up to try to help keep out the siltation. So that's just what we were experiencing in the 70s. So one of the big issues today is, what do you do about storm waste management? Right now, there's no regulation for storm waste management. If we had another hurricane, could you imagine what's going to happen to all of these 30 sewage treatment plants? They're all going to be dumping raw sewage right into the river. My wife and I were canoeing up on the kayaking up near the western branch maybe 3 years ago. I'm not sure. and there was a major thunderstorm the day before. And the water coming out of the Western Branch, which is where the Upper Marlboro major treatment plant is located, it stunk just like sewage. And the water was so powerful in my kayak, it was all I could do to try to move forward. So that was just like 3 years ago. So it's a big problem, but what we have here is some hope. Number one, we've got 2 laboratories that are doing work related to water quality. We have Pearl, which is part of Morgan State University. They're located at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. And then you've also got Chesapeake Biological Laboratory, which is part of the University of Maryland. So they're doing lots of research on what hopefully can be done to help the river. There's an effort underway. It's a little premature to be talking about it, but you may know that back, I think it was in 1980, there was a summit that was held to try to talk about the Patuxent and what could be done about it. And there's an effort being done to try to resurrect that, to say, hey, look, this is what we did in 1980. This is where we are today. What do we need to do for the future? So there are people that are working on it. I'm going to try to end on a little bit of a positive note and say that the Patuxent's not great, but it could be a lot worse, and it has been worse in the past. Yes.
There are sections of the Patuxent, especially up around Laurel and Savage Mill, that support a native brown trout population. So is it clean? It's clean enough for the trout, and the trout they are demanding of clean oxygenated water.
I think everybody can hear that. Those trout, by the way, are put in. They're not native. So they're stocked. But I mean, it's a good sign that some of the upper reaches of the river are clean enough that they can do that. Yeah. A lot of people may not realize, if you go back and look at the annual reports from the Fisheries Commission, they've had different names over the years, but it's amazing how many stocks of fish have been put into the river, such as shad. I mean, you wouldn't even think you would need to do that, but they were putting shad in, rockfish, particularly in the 50s and the 60s. We're talking about millions of fish that were being stocked in the Patuxent River, as well as other rivers in Maryland. So, I mean, it's amazing.
Catherine, do we have anything back in the back? We'll make sure do we have anything?
We've had a couple of questions about our water levels rising in the Patuxent, and we had someone ask, what was the last major fossil find in the Patuxent area?
What was the first question?
So, Catherine, will you repeat the first one, honey?
Are water levels rising in the Patuxent?
Oh. I do a whole lecture on that if you want to have me back.
Next year.
When you talk about sea level, I recommend you try to use the term relative sea level. And the reason I say that is because sea level is not the only thing that's going on. The Earth's crust is moving up and down. And unfortunately for where we live, the Earth's crust is moving up. So it's a compounding effect. We have worldwide sea level rise due to thermal expansion, due to the melting of the glaciers. That's all adding to it. But if you live in an area where the Earth's crust is moving up, that compounds it. Or where it's, moving down. Where it's moving down, it compounds it. So that's why in the Chesapeake, it's really important that you understand relative sea level. It's not just the accumulation of the sea, it's also what's happening to the Earth's crust. So why is the Earth's crust going down where we are here now? And part of the answer is that if you go back to the last major glaciation, when you had continental ice that was up to 2 miles in thickness, that put so much weight on the Earth's surface that it caused the Earth's surface to go down. And the irony of that is that in front of that, it caused the Earth's crust to actually go up. And that's called a forebulge. And the best example I can give you is that if you take your fingers and you push down in mud you know how the mud's going to come up between your fingers and around your hand. Well, that's what happened with these giant ice sheets. So much weight, it pushed down, and then around the edges of it, the Earth's crust came back up. Well, guess where the forebulge was from the last major glaciation? Right across essentially where Solomon's is located. So what that means is that now that the Earth's crust is going down, it's going down faster there because of the release of all of the ice. They no longer have that weight. And so that bulge is going down in addition to the normal subsidence of the Earth's crust. So it's kind of like a triple effect that we're in right here. Now, don't feel too bad about it because there's other places in the world where it's even worse than where we are. And a classic example would be the mouth of the Mississippi River, around the Gulf Coast of Texas, significant subsidence that's going on there. On the other hand, if you own property, let's say in Canada, well, there the Earth's crust is rebounding back up because of the weight. So you don't have to worry about quote unquote relative sea level rise. It depends on where you are. And where we are right now, it's a major factor. Let me throw in something you might find interesting. The J.C. Lohr Oyster House, it was built after the last major storm, 1933. They didn't call them hurricanes, but it was a hurricane. And when they rebuilt the J.C. Lohr Oyster House, they built it in such a way that all of the floors would naturally drain back into the creek. Today, because of relative sea level rise, the water in those creeks is coming up through those drains into the oyster house. So they've had to put a reverse on the drain so that it shuts when water level is high and doesn't allow the water to come in. But right now, to take a tour of the J.C. Lohr Oyster House, they only do it at low tide on certain days of the week. They don't even try to get people in there during high tide. And if we have high water like we've had recently because of low pressure, that's something we haven't talked about, but you know, high pressure, low pressure. When you have a low pressure, water level's higher. You don't have that heavy weight of air that's holding the water level down. That's why hurricanes, low pressures, create tidal forces, in addition to the wind that pushes the water up against the shore. It's all of these things that affect sea level. So that's why I encourage you to try to think about it as relative sea level. And where we are, it's an issue. And I would raise this question to the Calvert Marine Museum. What are you going to do in the future for the J.C. Lohr Oyster House? What are you going to do for the exhibition building at Calvert Marine Museum? During the hurricane of 33, there was a bug eye that was left high and dry on the site where the museum exhibition building is located today. Something to think about. I'm glad I'm not the director there anymore.
And I think the other question before you was, what is the most recent significant fossil find?
Yeah, the most recent significant fossil find, there's actually been several, but I would say the most significant is not a mastodon, but a mammoth. Do you guys know the difference? Mastodons are herbivores that browse, whereas if you're a grazer, you have different kinds of teeth. And to make a long story short, mastodons are much more common in the fossil record. There was an individual who just recently found a mammoth tooth in the Patuxent. And that's the first mammoth tooth. And I'm going to throw out a number, and I'm probably going to be within about 10% of being correct. Right now, we have about maybe 15 mastodon teeth known from the Patuxent River that are mastodon. We only have one mammoth. And the difference between the two, mammoth is a much bigger animal. It's really it's the animal that has the tusks that come out and kind of curve back up like this. Mastodons have very short tusks and they're smaller. So if you wanted a sexy elephant, you really want the mammoth. So we have a mammoth tooth now from the Patuxent River.
Do you have any more, Catherine, back there?
Yes, we do. We have a question about your new book. Will it include the history of Native Americans along the Patuxent?
Yes, it will. There's a whole chapter on Native Americans, starting at about 18,000 years ago. There's a hammerstone that was found at Patuxent Naval Air Station. It's not definitively known to have been used by humans, but I've had it in my hand. You can see the percussion marks all around the edge. It has the reddish color that indicates it was also in a fire. I think it's a pretty good bet that it was related to native peoples here in the Patuxent River. You probably know that more and more we're finding throughout North America evidence of peoples from 20,000 years or more. If you said that, 5 years ago, people would pretty much just kind of laugh at you, but it seems like more and more we're beginning to find out that people were here a lot longer than we thought. So the chapter goes from the Paleo-Indians all the way up to contact, including the issues with the native people, with the early settlers and all that kind of stuff.
Johnny, I'm coming over to you. Just
Eve found the Palmer point.
I'm sorry?
Eve found the Palmer point.
Palmer points are really cool. Was it in the Patuxent? Okay. The problem with paleo points, when we say Paleo-Indian, we're talking about the first native peoples that we know of that came in. Clovis is considered earlier. But if you talk about Paleo-Indian, I'm going to say in the Patuxent, maybe we know of 15 paleo points like that, but none of them have been found in context. So what's happened is that if you go back, we're talking 8 or more thousand years ago, the surface where those people lived has probably been heavily eroded. And so you're finding the projectile point that's out of context. Where you really want to go is where sea level would have been 8 to 10,000 years ago. And where is that? It's underwater. Because if you were a native person, you would likely want to be living near the water because you had a more diversity of food sources. You could get fish, for example, mussels, snails, as well as your deer and turtles and all that other kind of thing. So the logical conclusion is that most of the Paleo-Indian sites in the Patuxent are buried or they've been completely eroded away because the Patuxent River meanders, normal rivers meander. And by meandering, what I mean is they do this. And over time, what they're doing is they're eroding the soil away and depositing it, and they're continuing to do that. So early sites have been, in many cases, completely eroded away, and the other ones are underwater. So what we have is a very, very small window of opportunity to understand what was going on here Paleo-Indian-wise. You have a better opportunity to do that when you get out of the tidal area. So the parts of the Patuxent River that are above the fall line, to me, that's a more likely place where you could find better evidence. Okay.
So we could listen to you all night. Let me just tell you that right now. You are amazing. So I have 2 takeaways. Catherine, you heard him say something about him giving a tour. I think we need to try to do this sometime. You may be in trouble because you said it in front of Catherine and she heard you.
I already volunteered. You've got some program coming up and I'm doing a geology tour.
Catherine, well done. And when your book comes out, we want you back with the book. You have to promise you'll come back with the book.
Hopefully we'll all be around.
Everybody, give a huge welcome and thank you to Ralph for this. This is amazing. Just amazing.
Thank you.
We have one more speaker series this year. It's coming up on November 13th. It is a special showing of the movie that's going to be shown on Maryland Public Television. It's called Grandma's Hands. Craig Sewell of SMATIC has done this with the Southern Maryland National Heritage Area. He has gone into different kitchens, and so much of our culture and our heritage comes from our culinary, the culinary heritage that we share. And he's gone into kitchens and sat down with people and talked about how their families and their heritage and their culture is situated around the kitchen. And he's going to be here that night, as well as some of the people who were part of this documentary. I got a chance to see it in Annapolis. It is amazing, and we get the full cut. MPT gets a little cut, so we get the full thing. So make sure you come and join us. But Ralph, again, thank you so much. This was incredible. Thank you all for coming. Good night, everybody.